Howdy everyone, I'm J Wildberger, mathematician turned banker. And I want to tell you a little bit about my story today in order to explain to ordinary people a little bit more about the banking system. Now, I'm not an economist or an accountant or even a banker by trade, but I took up the profession a long time ago and I want to tell you about my story. So I think it's a really good idea for people to have a better understanding of the basics of banking and money. And there's a couple of questions here that we can use to sort of center our thinking. One of them is, what is banking about really? A lot of people have an idea that they understand what's going on in our modern banks, but actually the reality is crucially quite different. And then there's a sort of more ambiguous question about what is actually money and the role of money and how does that actually work? Now, I'm not saying I have answers to these questions. I just want to put them out there and to give you a framework. And to do that, I'm going to tell you my story, which is a bit of a toy story, okay? And it's going to be relatively simplistic. We're going to leave out all details and just go back to a simpler time long ago where we can explain, using just basic understanding and common sense, the natural evolution that I went through as a banker, which is analogous to some of the changes in the modern banking system. Okay, so let me tell you a bit about my story, but first, an important quote. Some famous words from none other than Henry Ford in 1922, who said, "It is well enough that people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system. For if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning." So, there's something to learn here. There's something to understand. And I think it's really important for people these days to be a little bit more conscious about looking actually at the banking system, which underlies our prosperity, our economic systems, and ultimately the well-being of a lot of us individuals. So having a little bit deeper understanding about that is something that I think is a great idea. And in fact, myself, I also want to deepen my understanding as well. So this is a way for me to do that. So our story begins in a little place out west called Little Cactus. In the year 1850, which is about when I got there, it had a population of around 300 people. And here's a picture of the main street with notably the bank that I created, Little Cactus Bank, prominently there, right next to the saloon. And over here is a sign for the silver mine, which is a couple of miles out of town. Now, back in 1850, things were quite different from the way they are now. There was not a lot of rule of law exactly out there in the West. We had to be more individualistic about things, and the prices of things, notably, was much less. So just to get you oriented to the price structure around that time, let me roughly say that the monthly wage of an average worker would have been, say, around $1. If you worked in the silver mine, that's what you could expect, $1 a month. The cost of a horse, maybe around $10. The cost of a house in town, maybe around $50. And now I want to explain to you this bank that I created. So I had some money from out east. I was originally trained as a mathematician, and I went out west, decided to make my fortune as a banker. So I created this Little Cactus Bank, and at first it was quite modest, but ultimately became quite successful. So I started out by, first of all, building my bank, and that cost a bit of money at that time, but I had some money. And then a year or two after I started, here was sort of the story that I had been able to build up at that time. Okay, so this is a couple years after I've established the Little Cactus Bank in Little Cactus. And here is the bank balance sheet around 1850. So a balance sheet is a very important financial statement which outlines the overall structure of a financial institution with assets on one side and liabilities on the other side. So the assets represent things that the company owns or at least controls, while the liabilities are the things that it owes typically to other people, to creditors. So around 1850, what were the assets of my bank? Well, prominently, there was the building itself, which I had created, and that cost me roughly $100. So that's certainly a prime asset. Now, to understand the other assets, we have to understand, first of all, where they came from. They came from depositors. So I got my fellow citizens to be interested in depositing their money, their hard-earned monies, into my bank, where it would be secure and safe in my very solid metal safe that I had in the back of my office. That safe cost me quite a lot of money, okay? And that was the safest place in town, so people came and put their paychecks or the money that they had saved into my bank for safekeeping primarily. But an important second aspect of doing that is that I gave them interest. So the interest rate back then was 5% for depositors. So every year they got 5% of whatever monies they had in addition to their principal. And that was an incentive for them to keep their money in my bank. So around that time I had about $1,000 worth of depositor accounts. That's how much money people from the town had put into my bank. Now what I did with that money? Well, over here, they become assets. So I had, first of all, deposits of cash, $500 cash, and also some silver, $100 silver. Now that makes $600. What about the other $400? The other $400 I had lent out as loans, which is what banks do. So I had lent out $400 worth of loans. People wanted a new saddle, or maybe a new horse, or a new pair of shoes, whatever. I could lend them some money, and I would, however, charge them an interest rate of 10%. Okay, so 10% on the loans, 5% on the deposits. So notice that there's a kind of a balancing here. The liabilities, represented by these depositor accounts of $1,000, is balanced by these assets here. The $100 in silver, the $500 in cash, and the $400 in loans. Now actually, when you came into my bank and got a loan, we would set up a loan contract. There would be an official piece of paper. And this was a legal document that certified that you owed me a certain amount of money and that you would pay it back with a certain interest rate, namely 10%, over, say, 3 years or 5 years or whatever. So those pieces of paper were actually assets, and they were also in my safe along with the silver and the cash. So there's almost a balance here, but there's just a little bit more on the asset side, and the standard sort of fundamental balance sheet equation reads that assets equals liabilities plus equity. So the difference between the assets and the liabilities is the stuff that I put in myself, or the amount of the company that I own. So the difference here is $100. That represents the amount of initial capital that I put into the bank in terms of actually building the property. So how would it look like in terms of cash flow for me at this time? Well, with $1,000 at 5% interest, I have to pay $50 a year interest to my depositors. $400 of loans at 10% interest means I'm getting $40 from the people who owe me money. That's not a profit-making proposition. But in fact, there's a few other ways that I can make money out of this situation, because I actually charge the depositors a small amount, 1 cent a month, in order for them to have their accounts. And I also charge the people who are setting out loans, I charge a transaction cost to actually establish the loans, because there's a bit of legality involved and we have to have a lawyer come and witness the signing. Okay, so at this stage here, I'm not making a lot of money, but I'm kind of just keeping my head above water. But we're looking for the long term. As we expand the business, this is going to become potentially quite profitable. Now, I have to be honest with you. So there's an important caveat to my description. So I was relatively naive back then when I started the bank because I hadn't any banking training. So I was just kind of doing the obvious thing. And the model that I've shown you in that first balance sheet really represents the standard view that people have about what a bank does. It takes money from depositors and then it distributes that money to other people as loans. And the difference between the interests on the deposits and on the loans is where the bank makes its profits. So this model is simple and it's widely believed, unfortunately, even by a large segment of the population these days, politicians and journalists. But in fact, as a description of modern banking, it is seriously misguided. Seriously misguided. What banks actually do is much more devious, or maybe we should say clever or imaginative. But some people might say it's even sinister. So that's one way of looking at it. But on the other hand, the banks actually provide a very useful and important service to society and to our whole economic framework. So there's different points of view as to what the banks are doing. But we first have to understand what the banks are doing. And to illustrate that, I'm going to go through my story, the evolution of the way my bank operated. From this very primitive, simplistic view towards a more modern approach of banking where credit starts playing a more and more important role. Okay, so now let's move forward a few years to 1855. And let me show you the balance sheet then. It was just around this time when a critical event occurred that really changed my orientation towards banking. Okay, so at this time, 1855, I had made some improvements to the building, so it was now worth around $300. Crucially, the depositor accounts were much healthier. I had now had $5,000 worth of deposits. Okay, so more and more people were depositing their money with me in my bank. What did I do with that money? Well, over here, in terms of assets, the deposits of cash in my safe is now $700. That's a little bit more, but not a lot more than I had before. I have a little bit more silver, $300, and I've also bought some gold with my profits because I like to have some gold, $200 worth of gold. And we have also $4,000 worth of loans now. So you can think about this $4,000 and this $700 and this $300. This is really the money I'm getting from the depositors, okay? And the $200 here of gold and the $300 of building, those are representing the equity that I've put in. So now let's talk about these ones here. So I have a lot more loans now proportionally than I did before. That's good for me because it's through the loans that I really generate my serious income, okay? The interest on those loans. So I want to jack this figure up as much as possible. On the other hand, I still have to maintain a fair amount of deposits and metals in my safe because I want to engender confidence in my bank. I want people to feel that my bank is solid, that I have a lot of net worth. That's why I always dress well, and why I put money into the outward appearance of my bank to make it look really impressive. It's the best looking building in town by far. So the way it works is that as long as people suspect that I have a fair amount of money in my safe, every so often I give them a glimpse of my safe as I open and close it. They can see all this cash sitting there and bars of silver and bags of gold. So they say, haha, this bank is serious. It's to be trusted. We can put our money in there. So if all of these depositors wanted their money back at the same time, of course, then I would be in serious strife. But that, well, never happened to me, at least not up till this time. So that was all okay. So we're all right with this level of deposits as long as the situation is relatively stable and confidence is high. And now, one day, something happened that was really important to me, which ushered in a new phase of my bank. maybe moving it into a more modern realm. And that was that the fellow who works in the shop, Sam the shopkeeper, came to me and said, Norm, I need a loan. I need a biggish loan because I want to buy Fred's house. Now, Fred is a big farmer, a very successful farmer who doesn't have an account with my bank up till now. He keeps his money under the floorboards or in his mattress or whatever, I don't really know. But he's quite wealthy and he has a house in town. And Sam got the idea that he's going to buy this house off of Fred. And he's going to use it as something of a house to live in, but also as a boarding house, sort of like an ancient Airbnb. And he's going to generate income this way. So he came and we had a long talk. He told me all about his plans. I know he's a good fellow. He's a solid citizen. It was a lot of money, though, because he wanted a $100 loan. This was way more than I had loaned anybody before. It was actually the first house loan that I had ever even considered. Up till then, it was just horses, saddles, trips, knickknacks around the house, etc., pianos. So after some consideration and discussion, I also had some discussions with Fred. I thought this was an okay deal, and so I went ahead. Okay, so I'll show you what happens to my balance sheet when I make up this loan. Okay, so there's going to be a new asset. Sam and I are going to draw up a contract, which is a legal document, and that's going to be in my safe. And so I can put here to say Sam's home loan. And that's going to be $100. Now, my first inclination was to give Sam the $100 cash, but he was nervous about that because that's a lot of money to be carrying around, and there's people around who very well might take advantage of that. So I had a really good idea. I said, what I'll do is I'll give you a check, a bank check from the Little Cactus Bank. Okay, and so what I did is I actually created a check, and maybe I'll write credit check over here. So I'm balancing this new asset with a new liability. That's sort of the way we have to work with balance sheets. We have to keep things balanced. So the credit check, that's going to be $100. That's now a liability. So I created a nice check, says pay $100 to the bearer of this check, signed Little Cactus Bank. So I'm saying this is an IOU that guarantees that whoever has it can come to me and I will give them $100 for it. It's basically equivalent to $100. So I gave this to Sam and said, okay, you can give this to Fred as payment for the house. I've already talked with Fred about this. He's okay. And then Fred will come and cash it, or we'll make an arrangement with Fred. So that's what happened. We signed the contract. I gave Sam the $100 check. He went to Fred. The house was signed over to him. Fred got the check. The next day, Fred comes to me and says, okay, Norman, I've got this $100 check. What should I do with it? I said, well, the sensible thing is just put it into my bank. Then you can make 5% interest on it. So he said, okay, that sounds good. So what I did then is I created another entry, Fred's credit account. $100. Okay, and I reduced this one to 0. Okay, so I've transferred on my balance sheet the $100 which was here to a new line, and now Fred has a credit account. That means he gets a passbook, just like all my depositors, and his passbook says that he has $100 in his account. That means effectively he is now in exactly the same position as all my other prior depositors, except for the fact that he has not given me $100 in cash. What I've gotten from him indirectly is this loan document that promises that Sam is going to be paying me $100 back in the next 10 years or whatever it was, with 10% interest a year added on top. Now, the important consequence of this transaction, I hope you can appreciate, because what I've done is I've made a significant new loan. So my loan book has increased significantly, but crucially, I have not had to reduce my deposits. I have the same amount of cash in my safe, the same amount of silver and gold in my safe as I did at the beginning of the day. All what I've done is created a new entry, essentially, on the liability side here, which has Fred having an account of $100. So that marginally increases the number of people who have a claim on my bank. The depositors and the creditors now have gotten a little bit bigger. There is more of them to share the pie with. But that's not a problem, because they're not all going to want their pie at the same time. If Fred the next day wanted to cash his $100, I would give him the $100 cash. But he has an incentive to keep it in my bank because he's getting 5% interest. So this is the crucial transaction that opened my eyes to a new way of doing banking. And from then on, the whole story changed with the history of the Little Cactus Bank. So now if we fast forward another 5 years to 1860, have a look at how the balance sheet looks now. So the bank has improved its position. We have more depositors. I now have $8,000 worth of deposits. I've made a lot of improvements to the building. It looks a lot grander now. It's got columns, it's got a marble staircase, it's got nice inlaid wood in the front room, so it looks really, really good. I've got more silver. Some of that's mine. I've got more gold. Some of that's mine. These are profits that I've made. I like to convert my profits to precious metals. But they're sitting in my safe. The deposits have also increased, but not by a huge amount. $1,000, that's fine. What's really changed from the last situation are these three things here that I've underlined in red. Okay, so building on the idea that I got with the transaction with Sam, I now have a new kind of paradigm for creating business. Yes, I want depositors, okay, but what I really want is to create loans. And now I have a new way of creating a loan. So you see there's two kinds of loans here. These are the loans that are sort of like traditional loans where I've actually given people money, right? They needed money for something and I actually got the cash and gave them the cash. Okay, so there's $6,000 of money that I've given that way. But there's $10,000 worth of what I call credit loans. Okay, these are loans which have, at least initially, a different character, although on the books they end up being sort of effectively the same. So what's a credit loan? Let me illustrate. So suppose somebody comes along and wants to take out a loan with me. Okay, so maybe a new home loan. Okay, maybe it's Bill. Okay, Bill wants a new home loan. By the way, the prices of real estate have gotten quite a lot higher in Little Cactus since we started. So a house now costs $200, quite a lot more than it used to. Okay, so I'm going to have to lend him $200 for him to buy a new house. Okay, so what happens is I create this entry, and this entry is supported by a loan contract which sits in my safe. So that's definitely an asset. That piece of paper is worth a lot of money to me because it represents the $200 that he owes me and that he's promised to pay back, as well as the 10% interest that he's also agreed to pay for the next 10 or 20 years, whatever it is that we're deciding on. Now, to balance that asset, I don't actually need to create a check. I could, and I have done that. But what I can do is something even simpler. I can just create a new credit account. So what I do is I just create an entry over here, Bill's new credit account, $200. So I create this entry and I give Bill a bank book which says, see Bill, $200. You have $200 in your account. So he can take that home, keep it in his desk, look at it, admire it. He's got $200. I've given him a loan for $200 by creating this account and putting $200 in that account. Crucially, I haven't had to touch my cash or precious metal reserves. I just create this entry here, create this entry here, charge him some extra money for a transaction fee, and then I sit back and as the years go by, I get my money back along with the crucial $20 a year of interest that he's agreed to pay me. And that's where this comes in. So I've been doing this now for the last 5 years. I've ramped up this side of the operation. The deposits have increased marginally since last time, but crucially the credit accounts, just like this one, have increased by a lot. I have $9,000 worth of credit accounts. These are people who I've made accounts for, and they got loans, $10,000 worth of loans, balancing with $10,000 of credit, $9,000 in credit accounts, and $1,000 in terms of credit checks, which are floating around in the community, effectively being used as cash. So this is a really important development, okay? That we can create a lot of new money in the town. This has been a hugely important development in the history of Little Cactus, because all this $10,000 worth of loans that I've given to people have been used to buy houses, to build houses. Then the people who get that money, the builders, the previous owners, they come to me and they end up with these accounts. Okay? So they end up with accounts which have not been generated by physical monetary deposits, but by rather these loans coming back around. And this has promoted a lot of development in the town. So we've been able to support a lot of businesses. New businesses have taken out loans with me. There's been a lot of real estate development. Prices have gone up. Everything is booming. I am a model citizen, and everyone treats me with a great amount of respect, because not only am I wealthy, obviously loaded, but I also am contributing to the economic prosperity of the entire Little Cactus region. So to summarize, at this stage in the bank's development, we've had some important new directions, especially having to do with the introduction of credit. But even just having a bank in town makes a huge amount of difference. So what are the benefits of having a bank in town? Well, first of all, there's security for deposits. Secondly, there's income for savers. People who have saved money can put money into my bank, and I'm giving them 5% interest a year. That is great for them. It also provides credit for expansion of farms. People can buy new farm equipment, they can buy new land, they can buy new livestock, they can take out loans, they can generate income by utilizing the capital that I can give them. But of course they have to pay the price. 10% interest a year, that is a price, but still that can often be a very good decision for people. Businesses, or sometimes even personal items to enrich the quality of life. And crucially, in the last few years, more and more of my loan book has to do with home loans. It turns out that once people start buying homes and the prices start going up, it grabs people's attention. Profits can be made. Other people come into the market. Immigrants come in saying, oh, this is a place that things are moving forward here. Let's get into the market. So the more people come, the more demand there is, the prices go up, and they have to come to me to get loans to get into the market. So it's really promoting giving people homes to live in. I'm an essential part of that equation as much as builders and developers. However, there's always some pros and cons to things. And you could also look at certain challenges that, that can be associated with banks. So one is the potential of theft. Okay? Theft looms as a very serious challenge. I, in fact, have an armed guard, and I have a couple of pistols in my office, so I'm prepared to protect my safe at all costs. But nevertheless, I have to worry about that. I have to worry about what happens at night, make sure that the building is safely guarded. You know, what if somebody breaks in and is able to steal my safe? That's the end of my career. Risky loans might default. So I might be lending some people, and this has happened, so a certain proportion of my loans go bad. The person absconds, or I had misjudged their character, or their references weren't really legit, and they end up defaulting on their loans, and basically I take a hit. Okay, so that's part of the business model. I have to take that into consideration, but I can still make money even considering that. But still, that is a risk. On the other side, some debtors become overburdened. It turns out that for some people, their grand business plans don't succeed as well as they had hoped. The investment that they've made don't generate the income they were looking for, and that 10% a year that I'm getting from them becomes a heavy burden for them. So they become overburdened, they become stressed, and that's a necessary consequence of this story. And then there's price increases. So undeniably, many people complain that since the banking in town has really risen to a new level, prices have increased, and that's definitely true. Okay, because there's more credit around, more money / credit, people are willing to pay more for things, so the prices of everything has gone up, especially houses. So it becomes harder for some people to stay afloat because of this credit kind of movement that's lifting all of the boats in the harbor. But I think overall I can be confident that the bank has been a positive development for Little Cactus. And it's at this stage now, around 1860, where some new developments start taking place. I'll tell you all about that in my next video. I'm J Wildberger. Thanks for listening.